Hi, this is Mary Ruge with Grand Valley State University, and you're listening to the podcast Tall, Graceful Men in Their Neat Blue Suits, interpreting the male menace in the fiction of Shirley Jackson. The world was a scary place in the 1950s, especially for women. From communism to nuclear war to the threat of another financial meltdown, the female population was encouraged to take cover from such threats under the roofs of suburban homes and in the arms of strong male providers. No longer was marriage just about love. It was about security on all fronts. Elaine Tyler May, author of the book Homeward Bound, was very much the same mind, saying they wanted secure jobs, secure homes, and secure marriages in a secure country. So they adhered to an overarching principle that would guide them in their personal and political lives: containment. Containment was the key to security. Containment is an interesting word to use because it insinuates captivity. Being contained inside the home meant women were not freely living their lives at home, but were being kept there. The suburban residence, supposed to be a woman's private space, became public domain when society began dictating how things should be ran on the domestic front, i.e., not raising quote-unquote sissies, not entering the workforce, being sexually submissive to the husband, for example. In her short story collection, The Lottery and Other Stories, Jackson parallels the struggle against loss with the struggle between her female protagonists and the recurring character of James Harris. Seen lurking throughout her writing, James Harris has been somewhat of an enigma to readers in terms of what he represents, but knowing he was inspired in part by a menacing man in an old ballad and in part by the oppressive figure of her husband, Stanley Hyman, the meaning behind Harris's appearances becomes clearer. Jackson's stories reveal her as a woman stalked, a woman who, even as the creator of literary worlds, is being watched and scrutinized by her own husband in spaces that should be her own. His domineering presence manifests in her writing as a character of James Harris, and he appears in various ways as a physical character, through name, through appearance, through an impressive presence perpetuated and weaponized by women. By considering the inspirations for and examining the various incarnations of James Harris throughout the haunted fiction of Shirley Jackson, one can see how his invasive presence in her stories represent the invasion of a society of the space and identity of American women, especially during the Cold War. In the epilogue to The Lottery and Other Stories, Jackson included the last 7 stanzas of James Harris' Damon Lover, an old English ballad that recounts the story of a woman who has an affair with a man who ends up being the devil. In the poem, she and James are in love, but when he goes to sea, she is told that he has died. Though devastated by the loss, the woman moves on and starts a family with another man. 7 years later, James appears at her door and convinces her to leave everything behind and run away with him. She decides to do this and meets up with James at his ship. Shortly after leaving port, the woman begins to feel a little uneasy about her decision. But by the time she finds out that the man she thought was James was actually the devil, it's too late. She cries out, but the devil simply tells her that she does so in vain. He says she will never have power and proceeds to break the ship in 2, drowning her at sea. In this sad tale, Shirley Jackson saw many parallels to her life and that of women in America during the containment of the Cold War. Like the heroine of the ballad, women were promised security and happiness if they'd only get married and raise children. Society also promised women that they would find fulfillment in their domestic duties and discourage the workplace as a viable option. In reality, what many women found in containment were empty promises. Worst of all, like the woman in the ballad, American women were forced to give up their private spaces, namely their homes, to public scrutiny or face being socially ostracized. Jackson lamented this loss because a woman's space, both physical and intellectual, is her freedom. It is her room to move, to be creative, to make choices, and essentially exist without conditions. In earlier feminist texts, like Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, the female narrator addresses the dwindling number of spaces available to women while discussing the funding of women's colleges versus those for men. She voices her concern about the lack of support, both financially and socially, for female institutions compared to that of males, and is discouraged by the fact that even spaces specifically designated for women, like a women's university, are in danger of disappearing altogether because they are simply not supported. She ruminates on the fact that though she hates being told what she can't do something, she also hates being told what she can do, which is an apt way to describe the consequences of containment for women. Putting it succinctly, Woolf's narrator says that though it is unpleasant to be locked out, it is, quote, worse perhaps to be locked in, end quote. In the same way society policed them by influencing social support of their public and private spaces, Jackson's Jim Harris polices the women in her stories and keeps them contained and under control. In The Lottery and Other Stories, this patrolman aspect of James Harris shows up quite often. In The Witch, James Harris enters the train car of a mother and her 2 young children, 1 boy and 1 girl. Though he is unnamed in the story, the reader knows it's Harris because he is described as being an elderly man with a pleasant face wearing a dark blue suit. Without acknowledging the mother in any way, James Harris sits down and starts a conversation with the woman's 4-year-old son, Johnny. Harris notices Johnny staring out the window and asks him what he was looking at. Johnny replies that he was looking for witches, and Harris decides to tell the lad a story. He describes how, though he loved his little sister very much, he strangled her, cut her into pieces, hit her with a stick, and fed her head to a bear. The mother is shocked by this awful story and tells Harris to leave. Ignoring the mother, Harris asks Johnny if the story frightened him. Although the boy says he isn't scared, the mother threatens to get the conductor. Neither Harris nor Johnny take her seriously, though, because the young boy informs her that the conductor will eat her and that he and Harris will then chop off her head. Pleased by the boy's response, Harris stands to leave, reminding Johnny that they will have to cut off his little sister's head also. After Harris leaves, the mother tries to negate his influence by telling Johnny that the old man was only teasing. The little boy concedes, but adds, quote, probably he was a witch, end quote. Do note that in the 13th stanza of the Old English ballad mentioned earlier, the James Harris Damon Lover, there is an insinuation that James Harris is magic. He struck the topmast with his wand, the foremast with his knee. Though he told it to Johnny, Harris used the story of maiming his younger sister to illustrate to the mother that he was more powerful than her and could move about in her space as he pleased. Though she did ask him to leave, Harris left only after he was assured that his threatening story was effectively transferred into the mind of her impressionable young son, thereby passing down his oppressive attitude to a younger generation of men. In some of Jackson's other stories, James Harris does not appear as a character, but as a threatening presence communicated by another woman, usually a wife. Acting more like Border Patrol in these stories, James Harris walks the periphery of the tale and, though unseen by the characters and the reader, ensures that women do not cross any lines. Communicating through the actions of a woman is significant because it shows that such patriarchal ideas are perpetuated not only by younger generations of men, but by the female population as well. In The Renegade, Mrs. Walpole is struggling to get her family out the door one morning and feels like she just can't keep up with her domestic demands placed on her. Making her day worse is a phone call from a nearby neighbor, Mrs. Harris, who is calling to inform her that the Walpole's lovely dog, Lady, has been killing her chickens. Mrs. Walpole suggests it isn't Lady, but Mrs. Harris assures her that it is and threatens her by mentioning how angry Mr. Harris is about the whole situation. She insinuates to Mrs. Walpole that he would have no hesitations about shooting Lady if he saw her on his property again. At its basest, this story is about a lady being threatened for doing what is in her nature to do and for going outside the boundaries of her own home. The renegade then is not so much about the dog, but about the freedom that she, Lady, represents. Lady wasn't burdened by the demands of society to be a perfect housewife or mother. She could follow her instincts and run wherever she pleased, and Mrs. Walpole envied that. Other writers concerned with female spaces, like Judith Fryer, echoed this feeling by saying that women, like Mrs. Walpole, are trapped by their homes, quote, a home that in America has not been her retreat, but her battleground, her arena, her boundary, her sphere, with no other space for her activities. Woman has been unable to move, end quote. By threatening Lady's ability to go outside her domestic space, Mr. Harris, via his wife, was telling Mrs. Walpole this is what will happen to females who dare to venture out of their spheres. The wife of James Harris, of course, also acts on his behalf, since he is not physically there. In the story, Mrs. Tyler passively struggles against her neighbor, Mrs. Harris, regarding the proper way to run a household. The Harrises have just moved in next door, and on moving day, Mrs. Tyler extends a kind invitation to James Jr., the Harris's boy, to join her daughters at the movies. Mrs. Harris responds by saying, "We do not go to movies, any of us." Mrs. Tyler seems puzzled by this, so Mrs. Harris elaborates by saying that her husband thinks they are, quote, intellectually retarding. Feeling somewhat insulted, but determined not to show it, Mrs. Tyler then suggests Carol, her own daughter, stay home and play with James Jr. instead. Mrs. Harris, visibly uncomfortable, never responds and asks instead that she and Carol come over to her home. Mrs. Tyler agrees to this and follows her over. Upon entering her own home, Mrs. Harris relaxes slightly because she's back within her boundaries. The fact that she could only be comfortable while contained in her home hints to the diligent reader that, as desired with Lady, Mr. Harris wants his wife on a very short leash. Mrs. Harris goes on to explain that they do not have a radio. Mr. Harris cannot bear the radio. Or read newspapers. Mr. Harris just feels newspapers are a mass degradation of taste. But they do read plays, pre-Elizabethan, of course. Upon hearing about all the restrictions Mr. Harris has placed on his family, Mrs. Tyler begins to get nervous. Quote, it was the way she felt when she was irrevocably connected with something dangerously out of control, end quote. Though James Harris isn't actually there, she still senses his controlling presence. Through the remarks of his wife, Harris has already invaded Mrs. Tyler's space. She knows he will be watching and judging everything she does from that moment on. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, another feminist author that came before Jackson, wrote a poem titled To the Young Wife that is shockingly appropriate to the story. In one stanza, Gilman questions the young bride, saying, "Are you content to reign in that small space? A wooden palace in a yard-fenced land, with other queens abundant on each hand, each fastened to her place?" Although written well before, of course, Gilman's poem echoes the same concern Jackson seemed to have for women marrying domineering men as she herself did. Showing how detrimental James Harris was to his wife's state of mind, Jackson was warning women and encouraging them to be mindful of their space. After seeing the lengths Harris will go to keep a woman in her place, what would happen if she crossed those boundaries prescribed for her? After reading more of Jackson's short stories, the answer becomes clear. When a woman crosses the line and enters the masculine world of work or autonomy, James Harris is no longer seen as an external force, but an internal one that steals a woman's identity and masculinizes her in an attempt at making her appropriate for that world. In My Life with R.H. Macy, the female protagonist begins her first day of on-the-job training at a department store. Because she's entered a space usually regulated to men, the workplace, the process of masking her feminine identity begins. This loss is seen in the women already working there, for they are all wearing tailored suits and sporting masculine, short-clipped hair, the basic uniform of James Harris. Additionally, the women are given numbers instead of names, and everything must be done in a very specific way, which allows no room for interpretation. Discouraged by what she sees, the story's protagonist ends up quitting at the end of the day. Through this story, Jackson echoes what Woolf had said earlier about women having nowhere to go. They can't work because they're stripped of their own identity, and they can't stay at home because there are just as many rules and regulations there, as proven with Mrs. Harrison, of course. Emily Johnson, the protagonist in Jackson's short story Trial by Combat, is also plagued by the James Harris attitude that influences her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Allen. With her, quote, neat dark blue housecoat and, quote, clean white hair, Mrs. Allen certainly resembles Harris. She has been stealing small trinkets from Emily's apartment, and though she denies it, when confronted, it is soon discovered that Mrs. Allen was indeed stealing from her upstairs neighbor. One may wonder why she would be prompted to steal, but it should be kept in mind that she is widowed and living alone, which makes her an autonomous woman. Long gone is the man who was supposed to give her security and identity as a wife. Without this sense of who she is, Mrs. Allen took things from another woman in an attempt to give her own life meaning. Affected by the invading spirit of James Harris, the little old woman in the dark blue housecoat invaded the space of a woman to make herself feel important and superior. At this point, the astute reader will be reminded that Jackson wrote other, more positive portrayals of Harris and raised questions about whether or not he was a bad character. To help answer this, one should look at the 7th stanza of James Harris' Damon Lover, the first in Jackson's ordering of the ballad. She set her foot upon the ship, no mariners could she behold, but the sails were o' the taffety, and the masts o' the beaten gold. Here the heroine takes her first step onto the ship and finds it devoid of human life. Though mildly disconcerting, she finds comfort in the ornate appearance of the boat. To her, this is like a promise of good things to come and abundant times ahead. Of course, after setting sail, she discovers the true identity of James Harris and ends up dying at his hands. But this moment before they set sail was a blissful one for her. Though she had left behind the wide open spaces of land to be confined on a small boat, the vessel evoked such romantic images of what her life could be like that she saw the compromise as inconsequential. Much like this heroine, the woman in Jackson's own story, The Damon Lover, and The Tooth, also hold illusory romantic ideals in their minds. In The Demon Lover, a young bride wakes on her wedding day and starts the day by going about her regular domestic duties, but does so in an uptight, ritualistic manner. For example, after making the bed, once, she hurriedly strips it when she realizes the sheets were not fresh. After taking a bath, she uses a towel, but promptly replaces it with a clean one. It seems she is staging her house to make it look like the domestic dream. This feeds into the idea that women are bred from birth to create the image of perfection when it comes to their home. Judith Fryer said, quote, girls created not moving pictures, but static scenes, images of domestic harmony. When her fiance, Jamie Harris, fails to arrive at the appointed time, she begins to worry and sets off around town in earnest search of him. She asks his whereabouts from landlords, shop owners, newsstand proprietors, policemen, but nobody can recall seeing him. One begins to wonder why Jamie never shows up and even begins to doubt his very existence. The importance of the story, though, does not lie in the whereabouts of Jamie. It is the expectations of the bride that matter here, and it is her desperate struggle to find security that drives this story. Understanding the security promised to women when they were able to get married, the panic consuming the young bride is acceptable. Her fiancé, Her one chance at securing a future is gone. In reference to the ballad, the bride's buying into the dream of this domestic bliss, which was equivalent to the woman marveling at the ship. And her inability to find her perfect groom was like finding the ship completely empty. Another positive view of James Harris in Shirley Jackson's collection is seen in The Tooth, about a woman, Clara, who was on a long journey to the city to have a tooth pulled. She encounters Harris, known only as Jim, in the story a number of times throughout, and because of her medication-induced haze, sees him in only the vaguest and most generalized of terms, tall and wearing a blue suit. After her tooth extraction, Clara wanders downstairs, and like a dream, Jim appears out of the crowd of people and whisks her away from the throbbing pain of her tedious life. Some readers interpret this as a happy ending for Clara, but one should notice the unreal, dreamlike atmosphere into which she and Jim disappear into. Her hand in Jim's and her hair down on her shoulders, she ran barefoot through hot sand. Aside from there being no chance of a beach appearing in the middle of New York City, Jim's perfect timing, Claire's drug state of mind, and her desire to be out of a marriage she never wanted all add up to the likelihood that Jim was nothing more than a mirage. If this is the case, then Jackson used this story to encourage female readers to not let the unrealistic depictions of love in media, quote, drug them, to the point that they cannot tell fantasy from reality. One should also note that Jim is a nickname for James, and nicknames are meant to be used between friends. Thus, James suggests a lighter, softer, friendlier version of the hardened James Harris character, a version that ends up being a mirage. In the end, James Harris was both fact and fiction to Jackson. As the overpowering tyrant in her stories, he was very real. As a kind-hearted savior, he was an apparition. This rang true in Jackson's personal life as it did in her stories. While many people considered her husband to be a brilliant editor and intellectual, to Jackson, he was a strong-armed dictator who controlled nearly every aspect of her life. Like the extravagant ship in the James Harris ballad, the idea of an author being married to an editor was a beautiful one, a match made in heaven. But having, quote, espied his cloven foot, Jackson knew his true character. Ultimately, she resigned herself to the rather pessimistic view that she and women of the Cold War era in general were like the heroine of the ballad, destined to lose themselves in the promise of containment and perishing without a place to call their own. Here are my references. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast, and I would encourage you to leave any thoughts or questions about this podcast in the link that is provided in the QR code with this podcast. Thank you so much.